I'd like to introduce our speakers and panelists today. Starting off, we have John DeCrane, Director of Alvarez & Marsal. He's their Director of Global Cyber Risk Services. John is an experienced computer forensic and cybersecurity expert with more than 18 years of experience as an information technology leader and a consultative expert. He's been with A&M for the last 12 years, where he led the cybersecurity examination of the world's largest oil and natural gas company and the nation's largest insurance company. John's experience includes providing cybersecurity guidance to the offices of 2 sitting state secretaries of state and a major Texas university. John joined Alvarez & Marsal after serving as leader of the IT organization supporting a Fortune 100 finance firm. He's joining us today to share some of his knowledge of applying the NIST framework to other industries so we can use it as lessons learned for the water wastewater industry. Following John, we'll have Bob George. Bob is the Director of Cybersecurity and Network Infrastructure Services at Tetra Tech. He has over 28 years of experience in the design, management, and support of IT and SCADA PCS networks. He holds a CISSP certification and has conducted network security assessments and designed and implemented cybersecurity controls for large and small utilities throughout the U.S. and Canada. He served as a technical investigator and subject matter expert for the development of the AWA Cybersecurity Guidance tool, which we'll be referencing a little bit today. And then wrapping things up will be Bob Daly, who's a principal consultant at EMA. Bob has been involved in control systems since his first college co-op job in the early 80s. After earning a degree in chemical engineering, he worked for EMA, where he helped water and wastewater industry clients with control system related projects. In 1999, he joined the South Central Connecticut Regional Water Authority as their INC leader, and then later was promoted to distribution manager for the authority. In 2014, Bob moved back home to Philadelphia and joined American Water as their manager of mission critical applications, which included automation and control systems, GIS systems, laboratory information systems. He recently rejoined EMA. He holds a professional engineering license, a Master of Business Administration, a Class 1 water treatment operator license, and a Class 3 distribution operator license. We're going to be talking about the AWA Cybersecurity tool today and also some of the applications of the NIST framework. But before we get started, I do need to mention that the AWA Cybersecurity tool is but one method for assessing and responding to cybersecurity risks, and that there are several other methods that exist. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to John DeCrane. John?
Good morning, everybody. I really appreciate you spending time with us this morning. My part of the panel will be spending some time trying to understand the NIST cybersecurity framework itself, how you can use the tools given to you within the cybersecurity framework, what exactly it means, what would an evaluation of your organization look like if you were to use the NIST as your guiding principle, and then we'll follow up with a little bit of practical examples of the kind of ways that as a consultant I might use the cybersecurity framework to sort of help a company understand what their risk posture is. This can be applied to all manner of industries. While the NIST cybersecurity framework was initially developed for critical infrastructure, the authors of the cybersecurity framework realized its importance to all industries. So as a consultant, we use the cybersecurity framework as a guiding principle while marrying that with informative frameworks from the industry that we might be dealing with. So in the case of wastewater or oil and natural gas, we would rely on the guiding principles of ISA control frameworks or the NIST 853 or others that might be relevant to the particular industry. So I'm going to go ahead and go through this. We'll talk a little bit about the framework itself, how it came to be, the components of the framework, and then happy to answer any questions that may arise. Unfortunately, I will not be able to stay on the panel through the end of the Q&A period. So if you do have questions that are NIST specific or anything that I might be able to assist you with, if you'll get those questions to Rick or to Julie, they promised to forward those to me by email, and I'll be happy to attack those and reply to all of them as they come up. All right, so the NIST framework has been in play for a number of years, going on almost 5 years now. It was originally developed as a result of an executive order by President Obama, 13636, which came into play on February 12, 2013. And this was born because the president and his team of advisors recognized the state of critical infrastructure in the United States, not only of its import to the citizens of the country, but how important those services were to the operation of the country itself. Originally intended for critical infrastructure, consultants like myself and the government really recognize sort of the power of the NIST cybersecurity framework and how it can be used to guide evaluations of cybersecurity postures in an organization. After he enacted this policy, the NIST, the National Institutes of Standard and Technology, was assigned the responsibility to put the framework together. They still hold that responsibility, and as a member of that organization, we meet every quarter to begin to discuss ways we may improve that, and there's already been a revision to the cybersecurity framework here very recently, last year in 2016. So one of the reasons why it was done was to help existing regulations promote cybersecurity. You may be very familiar with the recent President Trump executive order, which expands the definition of critical infrastructure beyond that you might normally think of oil and natural gas, wastewater, transportation and things, to other industries such as banking, healthcare, insurance, that the president and his advisors have deemed to be part of the United States critical infrastructure. I have seen in a number of international engagements that I've been a part of that there are organizations all over the world that have begun to adopt the cybersecurity framework as a way to construct their evaluation of their organization. It's extremely useful, but I want to emphasize that it itself is not a set of cybersecurity controls. You are not going to find in there, like you might other NIST frameworks or ISA framework controls, very specific language about the way that you should configure a particular control or a particular device. Really, the main benefit of the cybersecurity framework is that it helps in creating a lexicon, a language that we can use to standardize our interpretation of cybersecurity posture in an organization. The NIST cybersecurity framework is made of three main components. Those are the framework profile, the core, and the implementation tiers. And we'll go over those as we go over the next couple of slides. But I wanted to start with those so you can get an understanding of sort of what is compromising, what is the framework is composed of. The framework core itself provides a set of 5 activities, and we refer to them as activities because they aren't actual controls, that provide specific cybersecurity outcomes divided into the following categories: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Those individual framework cores are fairly self-explanatory, and as we go on, you'll see they're divided into 22 subcategories where we start getting into sort of the intent of the framework and how you might interpret your organization's cybersecurity. And this applies not only to sort of your copper wire network and your user network, but it does extend to ICS and SCADA networks as well. And as a consulting organization, we have used the NIST cybersecurity framework to help us guide a number of very large ICS SCADA examinations, because this framework fits neatly with the C2M2 maturity model and the ISA control framework. So if you were to use the NIST cybersecurity framework as your guiding principle, you would be able to plug in the very specific controls of the C2M2 maturity model or of any other regulatory framework for the locale in which you are operating. The implementation tiers provide context on how your cybersecurity risk and processes currently exist in the organization. In other words, they're where the rubber meets the road. They provide the metrics for you to communicate to leadership and to those who are undertaking controls within the environment what they need to do. So in other words, we use the implementation tiers to interpret our environment in a way that we can mechanize that information for improvement. And then the framework profile helps us set up what are our current state So after a gap analysis, we would determine using the implementation tiers where we are today. What does our organization look like today? You can do that at a very granular level, or you can do that at a very high level. Some very large organizations like to start with a very high level implementation tier report to understand, generally speaking, what is their posture, what is their risk culture. That helps them sort of define sort of the resources they might need to improve. The other side of the framework profile itself is your target state. So once we understand where we are today, it helps us articulate where we want to be tomorrow. So if we, through a matter of evaluation, determine of the 4 levels in the implementation tiers, which we'll dive into momentarily, that we're at a 2 of 4, and that our bosses are telling us in order to be comfortable, they really feel like we should be at a 3 in any particular category. This framework profile helps us get there. It helps us develop a roadmap to get from our current state to our target state. I mentioned that the framework is divided into 22 subcategories: the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Each of those have been well thought out to include these 22 subcategories. So in the identify core, when we say what is identified to ourselves, these are the things that we need to know about our environment before we can do anything to protect them. So by way of example, identify contains asset management, our business environment, how we govern ourselves through governance, risk, and compliance, risk assessments, and then risk management strategy. And here we find things like our risk tolerance, our risk appetite, sort of the terms you've probably heard from your managers in governance and risk and compliance, maybe even regulators have mentioned that to you. This is how we would sort of define that for ourselves. That would be the first step on an evaluation path. What is in our environment? Do we know how many endpoints we have? Do we know how many network devices are on? Or what does our network copper look like? That's what you would do here in Identify. Now, we're not going to spend time digging into all of these, but I wanted to provide that to you by way of example. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework is supported by a number of what we call informative references. Those external guidance and control mapping really help you understand the intent of a particular function within the NIST cybersecurity framework, how I might interpret that. We've seen a lot of clients push back and say, you know, I have my regulatory burden says that I need to be 850-53 compliant. But when I read those controls, they're fairly ubiquitous, and I don't really know how to interpret those in my environment, in my unique environment. The cybersecurity framework, when you look at it as a global, living, breathing, evaluative model, help you understand that, because it helps you tie how a particular control may be affected or affect other security controls in your environment. And so the informative references that were chosen when this was initially written, and by way of information, these are growing, by the way. The next version of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is going to contain at least 3 others. An example of that would be the NIST 800-171, which is the Department of Defense guiding control framework for securing controlled unclassified information. So if you do business with the government and you maintain unclassified but yet controlled information, you'd be required to use the 800-171. The NIST has seen a need to plug in additional informative references. So you're going to see this list grow. The ISO 27K, which probably many of you are very familiar with and are implementing today, all of the controls in the 27K have been aligned with the NIST cybersecurity framework, which would help you interpret those controls and how they may affect or be affected by other controls. The framework implementation tiers are broken into 4, as I previously mentioned. Those are from the lowest, moving upwards: partial, risk-informed, repeatable, and adaptive. And we'll dig into those in just a minute to try to help you understand how you may interpret or define where your organization fits within those implementation tiers. And then generally speaking, to improve your cybersecurity program, the NIST recommends several very simple high-level steps, beginning at prioritizing and scoping, moving all the way through implementing an action plan. And you see step 3 and step 5 there were part of that profile that I spoke about moments ago that give you your current profile and your target profile. And essentially, you can think of the difference between my current profile and our articulated target profile is our gap. And so we would use that to help us define a roadmap for improvement in moving from our current to our target profile. So here is an example of how the other informative references sort of align. And here you can see in the illustration ID.AM1, which is Identify Asset Management, the first subcategory. That the very specific controls from those frameworks that I mentioned are listed here. And as a consultative agency, one of the things that we have done is taken the NIST and we've aligned it to some 24 other regulatory frameworks. So if you're in banking and you use Basel or FFEIC, or if you're in healthcare and you're using HITRUST, you're able to then quickly get to the specific configuration controls or security controls that are required. And it helps us sort of align to an individual regulation. Here's an example of that, and I apologize in advance. I did not have time to put together an illustration that was wastewater specific, but I'm going to use here an insurance or a sort of a healthcare specific framework known as HITRUST. And in my opinion, HITRUST is the most, in the world today, the most comprehensive and the most secure framework available. And we recommend to organizations, while you may be required to do 853 or 800-171, those are only a subset of what is produced by HITRUST. And it's worth a look at the HITRUST cybersecurity framework to understand all of the controls that the government requires of medical providers to keep your medical information safe. And so I use this as an example to show all the alignment. Here's every one of these except for the first have multiple controls that are associated with that. And the pictures at the bottom there sort of show you an example of the 5 or 6 that we're able to map very quickly. And again, we have several dozen previously mapped. So that work is possible, and much of it exists on the internet today. So if you're looking to evaluate your organization or your SCADA environment, I would strongly suggest that you look on the internet, or if you email me, I'm happy to sort of help you understand what that looks like, how you might be compliant with ISO or some of the ISO 27K controls, and how NIST can help you get there. And I'll emphasize again that the NIST really is an evaluative framework and not a set of specific controls. So you're not really going to find, go do this to this machine or go do this to the registry in order to be secure. It's going to help you understand, because it is a large body of work to do an evaluation of an organization, how you would move through that organization and tie it to the specific controls. And then here's an illustration of the 3 main components of the NIST, the core, the profile, and the tiers, and just sort of demonstrating to you that your gap analysis sort of occurs, and this is a Venn diagram if you're familiar with that, the intersection of those 3 components of the NIST. This is where the real work gets done. This is where the gap analysis to help you expose those areas that do not meet the burden that you have to satisfy from a cybersecurity perspective. The implementation tiers is, in my opinion, the most valuable part of the cybersecurity framework. And I say that because despite all the evaluation that we may do, despite all of the control testing and these kind of things that we may undertake, I still have to communicate that to my clients, or in your case, you still have to communicate that to regulators or to your bosses. The implementation tiers give you language to help you define what you've discovered. And in each of the tiers, we basically ask 3 questions of you when deciding what the score is for a particular function. Tier 1's partial. We say that means your organization has a ad hoc risk management. So risk management being the first question that we ask. How good at risk management is this organization? Is what they do simply ad hoc? They fly by the seat of their pants and they make decisions based on today's firefighting? Or are they adaptive? They actually have valuable and tried and true risk management processes. They follow C2M2, they have RIMS, they have these other maturity models that sort of help them with their risk management practices. They're able to define what that looks like from an ORSA perspective if you have regulatory burdens to opine to a regulatory body what your risk burden is. And in between there, your risk management, you're going to fit anywhere in those four categories. Helps you understand, as the first question, how prepared you are for understanding your individual risk. And I would posit that if you undergo in a truthful way a cybersecurity framework evaluation, many of you will find that you're probably in a 1 or a 2 from a risk management perspective. One of the most difficult things to do in an organization. And then the second question we ask is sort of, what is the awareness of the organization as they deal with the outside world every day? Are we aware of the threats that we face today? You know, yesterday was released in the news another version of a sort of a WannaCry ransomware, and it is affecting heavily ICS and SCADA environments in the EU, embedded operating systems such as ATMs and these other things in banks in the EU. Luckily, we've not seen a lot of that here yet, but again, I would posit that buckle up because it's coming. There's a lot of information out there about new threats facing us in the coming weeks and months that are dangerous to organizations in the U.S. So we ask ourselves as part of the 3 questions, how aware is the organization of the threats that they face today? And then the last question that we ask as part of our tier level definitions is, how well does the organization participate with external resources? Do you belong to organizations like LEAP? Do you participate in these kind of webinars to learn more about the world around you, not just from a threat, but what can I do? And then if you're really adaptive in sort of that external participation, you are participating as a source of information, that you are not hesitant about sharing what your risks are with others in the industry like you to help improve others. As a community of wastewater or oil and natural gas companies, we should be sharing this information amongst ourselves. The bad guys already know it, so we're not telling them anything they don't know, but we're helping each other understand where we are. It's really an important concept when trying to understand what a company's risk posture is. We use a term we call risk astute. And if you're going to be risk astute about the way you run your organization, you really seek to be at a 3 or a 4, most certainly in the risk management and the actively shares information. It's extremely important. You will not do well in providing cybersecurity defenses if 1, you don't know what the outside threats are, and 2, you're not actively sharing, ingesting information from the world. And then on the right, you see the scoring definitions, and this is the world according to my employer, Alvarez & Marsal. We sort of come up with this scale to help organizations understand. So if you're down at between a 1 and a 2, we really feel like that requires intervention. This is something that you need to stop right now, find an expert, and help you get this fixed. If you're all the way up to a 3.5 or 4, then we really feel confident that you can just do an annual review or continuous monitoring to make sure that that doesn't change. And then sort of stratifying across the different implementation tiers, you see sort of our opinion as to what you should do. Should you reach out to an expert? Should you hire somebody with specific expertise for an area that you're not doing well in? I think this plays very well in the ICS SCADA world, because those are very unique and very honed skills, and finding folks to do that for you well is very difficult. So if you're finding that you don't score well in some of those areas that are directly related to your ICS and SCADA subnets, then I would certainly suggest that you find expertise in that. This is an illustration, comes directly from NIST. This is not one of ours, that sort of helps you understand how you can use the cybersecurity framework to interoperate and communicate and collaborate with your entire business, how you can use the profile to communicate at a business process level the kind of improvements, and then again using that to communicate with the executive level about what the risk appetite should be. And by way of definition, if you're unfamiliar with risk appetite, this is what I am tolerant of as far as a specific risk goes. I'll give you a very mundane example. If you run Exchange, you might decide as an organization that you cannot be without email any longer than 4 hours. So your risk tolerance for outages on email is 4 hours. Any control in place that does not support you maintaining an online Exchange server for longer or less than 4 hours is intolerable. So this is sort of an example of how you might help define that to your organization. Typically, we find that executives are the one defining risk tolerance, but in organizations where this is not something that you do well, we usually rely on the subject matter experts to help the executives understand how they might make changes in their risk management strategy, and the cybersecurity framework can help you articulate that to your bosses. We deviate a little bit from the cybersecurity framework so I can help you understand how an evaluation of a cybersecurity program might rely on the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And we've color-coded these to match the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Those are all 5 of those cores are color-coded, and those help you sort of understand how each of these activities might fit within that framework. The framework is not just so you can sit down, ask or pass a questionnaire to all of your employees and then score yourselves and pat yourself on the back. There is a lot of real work, real control, objective examination required for you to get a fulsome understanding of your risk posture. And this is an example, and there are many other activities you might undertake, especially for ICS. But I wanted you to understand what that workflow might look like, how you might use the cybersecurity framework as a guiding principle to get through a cyber evaluation. And then it's also really important that you understand, you might take on the most fulsome cybersecurity framework evaluation on the planet, but you still really have only gained what we refer to as the lowest tier of confidence in your organization. The cybersecurity framework does not ask you to do pen testing, technical testing, regulatory mapping exercises, and some of these other what we call tier 2 confidence level activities, nor does it ask you to do very specific control testing activities. And as you all might agree, control testing is the way that you achieve the highest level of confidence. So this just sort of shows you where the NIST cybersecurity framework fits into your evaluative model. It is at the bottom right, so it is at the sort of lowest level of confidence, but we would posit that it is the very best way to begin. And again, pairing that with a regulatory framework or a set of control frameworks really helps you define, as you move up into tier 2 and tier 3 confidence levels, what your path might be, what that roadmap might be. This slide is a couple of examples of how we might communicate that to our clients, and in a lot of ways this is very board ready and not very subject matter expert ready. But the picture on the left shows you in a spider diagram where this organization scored in the colored picture here, where they scored currently today. This is where they sat today. The orange dots are the target state that was given to us by the executives of this particular organization. So you can see the difference between the target and the current state and where they scored is the work that they have to do in the coming calendar year to be where their bosses tell them they need to be. And then the one on the right is sort of demonstrating the same information to you in a tabular format so that you can sort of understand how we score. And we did a heat map here to show you where this particular organization was doing well. This is a very mature, very large enterprise. So they did not score poorly in any category, and in some categories scored very high. This is uncommon. You will find most organizations that we deal with specifically, and I think that this will be true for you, is that you'll be somewhere between mid-1s to 2.5 or so. I would not expect in the first pass of an evaluation that anybody on the phone call is 3s or 4s. It takes a great deal of work to get to a 3 or 4. And then here, this is how you might communicate the very specific information that you've learned through your cybersecurity framework evaluation. These findings, and I won't go over these in detail, but the thing I wanted to point out to you is how these external references have been mapped. So later when these are provided to you and you want to read through these, you will be able to see exactly the control frameworks that mapped to these findings and how the organization may go about correcting that. And then the very last thing is a much more detailed observations of findings that this particular organization had that we found when we were there, showing exactly where they had weaknesses and strengths so that they could rely on those strengths to help them improve their weaknesses. That is the end of the presentation, and I'm glad to answer questions at some point at the end. Rick, if you'll forward those to me, I'd be happy to show that. So I am going to introduce Bob George, who is up next, and I will pass the control to him so he can do his presentation. I appreciate you guys' time and patience, and thank you for your attendance.
Thank you, John. So my presentation will be more on the applicability of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or CSF as I'll refer to it briefly, and focusing a little bit more on its relationship to water and wastewater utilities and how we are both using and encountering the cybersecurity framework with customers, using it to address the specific needs of the water and wastewater sectors. So again, just a brief recap on some of the information that John presented. The NIST has its origins with the Executive Order 13636 going back to February. It is a voluntary framework designed to assist organizations with managing cybersecurity risk. It does provide a basis for comparing current states to desired future states, and is particularly well suited to providing a basis for a gap analysis. And it is not specific to any industry. So again, voluntary, not specific to any particular industry. The AWA Cybersecurity Guidance tool, which Bob Daly will be presenting in more depth after my session, was developed in parallel with, but independent of the NIST cybersecurity framework. It is aligned with the NIST framework. So there is some overlap in terminology. They are designed to be complementary to each other. But again, the cybersecurity framework is general, applies to any industry. The AWA Cybersecurity Guidance is specific to water and wastewater and the specific needs of SCADA and industrial control systems. And a particular note, the EPA has designated the AWA Guidance as the official guidance for water and wastewater. There are a couple of case studies, just examples where, again, we are encountering the tool in the field with water and wastewater customers. We're finding it particularly useful in two scenarios. The first being SCADA master planning. So although SCADA master planning occurs at a high level, we're not getting way down into the details there. Cybersecurity is an increasingly important part of this master planning, particularly when you talk about SCADA visions, where your organization needs to be in a few years with regards to sharing of data and so forth. Certainly is dependent on network infrastructure, and cybersecurity should, of course, be a key part of that. So the implementation tiers that John described can be aligned with organization's vision. So you have your existing implementation tier describing your state of readiness, and then the organization's desired approach, appetite for risk, as John mentioned, can be set as part of that SCADA vision. And then the framework core can be useful for identifying that gap. So basically, where are you now? And if you will, who would you like to be when you grow up in terms of cybersecurity capabilities? As John mentioned, we have not encountered the cybersecurity framework extensively with water and wastewater utilities, but those that we have are coming in typically scored about a 1.5 to 2.5 range in terms of the implementation tiers. And of course, it can be useful in actually conducting a cybersecurity assessment, even if it's not a detailed assessment. And here again, the implementation tiers can identify your current and desired capabilities. The gap analysis can be used to score overall readiness. Now, I do put the word score in quotes. So it is not a pass-fail type of rating. It is not necessarily a ranking on each of the particular areas in terms of functionality. But again, it does rank your readiness of where you are to where your organization organization wishes to be in terms of readiness. And then, of course, these identified risks can be used to prioritize efforts as you move forward after the cybersecurity assessment. So the state of the CSF, the cybersecurity framework. It is a living document. Things continue to evolve. As John mentioned, a lot of work is going on. There was actually some legislative action earlier this year that resulted in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework Assessment and Auditing Act of 2017, which mandated that NIST develop outcome-based and quantifiable metrics. So going from more of a qualitative approach to getting into somewhat of a more quantitative, actual hard scoring and metrics. And then President Trump's Executive Order 13800, Strengthening Cybersecurity of Federal Networks and Critical Infrastructure, was issued just over a month ago, and basically requiring all federal agencies to use the NIST Cybersecurity Framework to guide cybersecurity risk management. And then other implications of the executive order. It is making the cybersecurity practices of publicly traded companies that own critical infrastructure more known to the public and shareholders. So the idea is that there's more availability of information. They're moving, they don't like to refer to it as basically shaming the organizations, but basically the practices will be coming under increased scrutiny. And then Homeland Security was also directed to provide a report to examining the sufficiency of existing policies and practices in addressing critical infrastructure. Here again, the primary focus is on publicly traded critical infrastructure entities, and Homeland Security is to provide that within 90 days. So we're partway through that window now. The particular thing of note here, the current focus is on publicly traded companies. So it's not necessarily all regulated utilities at this point. We can expect to see more of that in the future, but there has been a lot of discussion in the press about that emphasis on publicly traded infrastructure companies. So conclusions, and I apologize, my slides are somewhat brief due to some reorganization of the presentation. But basically, where are we now? So in terms of cybersecurity, we have the cybersecurity framework, the AWA Cybersecurity Guidance tools. These tools are available, but we still find the state of readiness varies greatly between water and wastewater utilities. Oftentimes, even within the same organization, as we move between plants or different areas of management, we'll find discrepancies. Some organizations have robust programs, but a lot of organizations are still struggling with the basics. So although the development of the AWA Cybersecurity Guidance tool and the NIST Cybersecurity Framework were driven by the GAO report that described an abundance of cybersecurity guidance, we still find that utilities are unaware of some of the guidance or sometimes confused by seemingly competitive initiatives. So that's part of the reason for this presentation, is to help clarify the relationship of the cybersecurity framework to the AWA guidance. Guidance does vary in how it prioritizes cybersecurity. So the hope is that by having some of this more sector-specific guidance, we can focus on the specific needs of SCADA and industrial control systems for water and wastewater. The importance of proactively addressing your cybersecurity rather than waiting for a mandate cannot be overstated. So I think it goes without saying, as these things gain prominence, as these functions, as these mandates begin to play, you don't want to be at the end of the pack. You don't want to be the organization that doesn't have things together, and particularly if asked at a state level or a federal level, you want to have a cybersecurity program that you can describe that is addressing your cybersecurity requirements. Boards and management are less likely to be understanding of cybersecurity compromises than they would have been in the past. And particularly the perception of the utility as insecure and potentially unsafe is unacceptable in our current operating environment. So what works well is a combined approach for water and wastewater. So the NIST Cybersecurity Framework does give a roadmap for identifying and mitigating cybersecurity risks that is aligned with the criticality of your systems. And this can be combined with the AWA Cybersecurity Guidance tool to provide basically ways of identifying the criticality of SCADA and industrial control components and prioritizing your efforts to mitigate those. And with that, again, a brief session here. And I will hand things over to Bob, but I seem to have lost the button that lets me turn it over. Let me see here.
I'm all set, Bob. I think I'm displaying now.
You got it? Good. Okay. I'm glad you have it. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Bob, for handing the presentation tool over to me. And thank you, Rick and Wheat, for this opportunity to talk about the AWA Cybersecurity Guidance tool. So as many may be aware, AWA has been proactive in development of cybersecurity guidance for the industry. AWA G430, Security Practices and Operation and Management, was first issued back in 2009. That manual provides broad coverage of water system security, including some guidance for cybersecurity, but it's wasn't very heavily based on providing guidance for cybersecurity itself. AWA recognized that more immediately actionable guidance for cybersecurity was needed and began to develop the Process Control System Security Guidance for the Water Sector Manual at about the same time that NIST was developing the cybersecurity framework. The guidance for the water sector was first issued on April 4th, 2014. At the same time, a cybersecurity guidance tool was developed to help provide recommendations tailored to our industry and to your utility. The guidance manual and tool have since been updated to reflect the need for some additional cybersecurity control measures. So again, it has proved to be a living document where we're adding to it and improving it over time. The AWA Cybersecurity Guidance tool provides water sector guidance, including consistent and repeatable recommended courses of action to reduce vulnerabilities in process control systems. The target audience for the output of the tool are water utility managers, CIOs, and directors who have responsibility for process control systems. The tool fulfills the need for sector-specific guidance as specified in Executive Order 13636. And lastly, the tool aligns with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and the guidance manual provides a cross-reference to show this. So later in the presentation, I'll show a little bit of that cross-reference appendix. So in this slide, I've highlighted water sector guidance to show that the tool was developed specifically to provide guidance to our industry. This contrasts with the cybersecurity framework, which is more broad, so it can apply across sectors. I've also highlighted process control systems. The tool is targeted to provide guidance for industrial control system security. The cybersecurity framework is not as focused. Lastly, I highlight that the tool aligns with the framework, so they're not mutually exclusive. They complement each other. As required by Executive Order 13636, the EPA in May of 2014 reported back to the White House in the letter that's shown here on your screen that the American Water Works Association has issued process control system security guidance for the water sector and a supporting use case tool. This guidance identifies prioritized actions to reduce cybersecurity risk at a water or wastewater facility. The cybersecurity actions are aligned with the cybersecurity framework. This tool is serving as implementation guidance for the cybersecurity framework in the water and wastewater systems sector. So, so again, we have the EPA behind us in terms of the use of the tool to help make sure utility efforts in the process control area are aligned with NIST. So how does the tool work? And so this is a slide that shows an overview of how the tool works. So the tool presents a set of use cases to you. You work with subject matter experts in your utility to select the use cases that match your utility. Based on the use cases that you select, the tool outputs a report with a prioritized list of recommended
cybersecurity controls for your utility. For each control listed in a report, the report also provides a reference to a corresponding standard so that you can find more information about the control. The result is a comprehensive set of recommendations that can be put into practice immediately and that can quickly yield tangible results. I'd like to say a little more about the controls. So at the core of the tool are 94 detailed cybersecurity controls. The overall set of controls incorporated into the tool were selected by a team of key industry personnel and subject matter experts in cybersecurity and related areas. The approach used to develop this list of controls was to combine the operational knowledge of the team with best practices and information from a number of security standards from folks like DHS, NIST, AWA, Water ISAC, and others. So the tool itself is a use case-oriented, web-based application in which users review and select use cases which most closely match their situation and then generate a report. You can access the tool from the AWA website by entering awa.org/cybersecurity. So right here is the link. Again, that's awa.org/cybersecurity. If you try to navigate to the tool from awa.org, it's a little tough to find it. So use that shortcut that we have on the screen, or alternatively, use Google and just search for AWA Cybersecurity Tool. And one of the top links returned to you should get you right to this page. So once you're on the Cybersecurity Guidance and Tool webpage, you click on the Access Cybersecurity Tool link. And so that's right here. Note that you'll need to log in as an AWA website user to access the tool. But you don't have to be an AWA member to be a website user. So you don't have to be a AWA member in order to use the tool. The other thing I wanted to note while I was on this page was that you can also download the Process Control System Security Guidance for the Water Sector Manual from this webpage also. It's right here, right above the link for accessing the cybersecurity tool. So when the tool successfully runs after you log in, you'll see this web interface. Below an introduction, the tool presents the use cases. So here's the introduction, and then the list of use cases begin right down here. As you scroll down, you'll see more use cases. The tool first presents use cases related to your system architecture. As you review each use case, you check the box that is next to each use case that applies to your utility. So, you just come in here and you place a little check mark next to those that apply to your utility. For example, for AR2, if you have a wide area network infrastructure that is shared by both SCADA and non-SCADA networks, you would check the box next to AR2, so right here. So it's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to use tool. So the Cybersecurity Guidance Tool presents 5 categories of use cases. So as you scroll down, you'll see those categories. As we saw in a previous slide, one category is architecture. The others are network management and system support, program access, PLC programming and maintenance, and user access. There's a total of 40 use cases spread among the 5 categories that you need to review. So once you've completed the selection of the use cases and you've scrolled all the way down to the bottom of the tool, you can create your report by clicking on the button labeled Generate Report. So obviously it's right here. So the report can be viewed online or downloaded as a PDF. Note that your use case selections are lost after a timeout period. So it's best to download the report if you want to view the report again later. The report starts with an introduction that describes the rationale behind the prioritization of the controls. The introduction also reminds the user that the tool does not make any attempt to assess which controls the utility may already have in place, and that the utility must evaluate each recommendation against measures, policies, and procedures currently in place and develop a plan of action for addressing those controls not yet implemented. So the tool indicates what you should be doing. You still need to use the output of the tool to go back and assess your current situation against the tool to identify any gaps. So, after the report prints out, after the introduction, the report lists the use cases that you've selected, and you should confirm that the listed use cases are appropriate and that none are missing. In other words, just make sure that you appropriately clicked on the boxes that you intended to click on, or double check that you didn't miss clicking on any of the boxes. The report then provides recommended cybersecurity controls in order of priority. There are 4 priority levels. So we're showing the priority 1 controls as an example here. So priority 1 controls are the highest priority, and they provide the most impact on cybersecurity in the short term. So this slide just zooms in a little bit on one of the controls that you might see. And so that I can point out that each control that's listed includes plain text wording so that the control is easier to understand than it might otherwise appear in some of the standards from which the control was derived. And then also those standards from which the control was derived are listed also for you, so that if you need more detail or want more information, you can look them up using a reference for the standard that's printed out with the control. And so you can get more information about the tool, the use cases, and the recommended controls by downloading that Process Control System Security Guidance for the Water Sector manual that I previously showed was on that same web page as the cybersecurity tool itself. And so this slide shows the use case listing. So it's important to know that the cybersecurity tool does not save your use case selections between uses. So that's, and so in addition, there's a timeout feature. So if you sit down and you start to work with some of your subject matter experts and you're selecting use cases, if you go over a certain time limit, you won't be able to generate your report. And you can imagine that would be very frustrating. So to avoid the frustration of losing your use case selections in the tool, it's highly recommended that you download the Guidance for Water Sector Manual, and specifically this Use Table 3-1 for reference, and use that as a tool to highlight those use cases that you want to select. And then when you're working with your subject matter experts, and then return to the tool later once you've filled that all out and indicated what you're going to select, and go through and much more rapidly select the use cases so that you don't have the frustration that I mentioned earlier. And so earlier in the presentation, I mentioned that the guidance manual also references the NIST Cybersecurity framework. And so Appendix A, the Process Control System Security Guidance for the Water Sector Manual, includes this cross-reference table. The table provides a cross-reference between the cybersecurity controls incorporated into the AWA Cybersecurity Guidance tool and the NIST Cybersecurity Framework core functions that we previously heard about, including their categories and their subcategories. So if you want to see how the two align, this appendix is an excellent resource. And so if you want to learn more about the use of the tool, we've been working with AWA to develop training materials and workshops to aid utilities in the use of the tool. So last week we conducted a training workshop in Richmond. We'll be holding the same workshop in Dallas on July 28th. So check with Texas AWA if you're interested. As part of the workshop, we're training regional trainers who can conduct the sessions in the future. So you might expect some follow-on sessions also in your region by those trainers that we will be training. And I wanted to mention that I did look on the Texas AWWA website under the training menu item, and I didn't see this training listed. I did a Google search for cybersecurity tool, in Texas, and I came right to the proper web page for registering. So you might have to search a little bit to find it if you want to register for it. And so in conclusion, the Water Sector Coordinating Council has stated that AWWA's Process Control System Security Guidance for the water sector and a use case tool will serve as a foundation for the water sector's adoption of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. To date, more than 4,000 cybersecurity guidance tool reports have been downloaded from the website. So that's a fair number. A fair number of people are using the tool. Again, thank you for this opportunity to introduce the cybersecurity guidance tool. And now I'll hand the presentation back to Julie and Rick.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. I appreciate to both Bobs and John. As John mentioned during his presentation, he had another commitment and he had to drop off the call. But we did want to continue on with our discussion here with Bob George and Bob Daly as we go through this and try to get a full understanding of the NIST framework as well as the AWWA Cybersecurity Guidance Tool. I want to remind everybody that if you have some questions that you'd like me to pose to the two Bobs, feel free to suggest those through the chat session, and they'll get routed through so that we can talk about them as shown on the screen right now. Julie, if you could go on also to the questions that we need to cover. For those of you that are seeking CEU accreditation, these are the questions that you'll need to respond to, and so we covered these throughout the three presentations. As far as the NIST framework we've been talking about, that's developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The use of the NIST tool is not mandatory, as Bob George indicated in his presentation. And as far as accessing the cybersecurity guidance tool, it can be accessed from www.awwa.org/cybersecurity. Thanks, Julie. So let's, I guess, transition now to the panel discussion. And I'll try to keep the last names involved as I pose these questions, since we've got both Bobs on here. But Bob Daly, EMA has been instrumental in working with AWWA to develop the guidance tool. You talked about how you have to pull in the various subject matter experts as you're going through that. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and talk about as you're going through the guidance tool, you've got a background both as a consultant and working for a utility. So who might be the best candidate to lead that effort from a utility standpoint, and then what subject matter experts they may need to pull in to help guide them through to the conclusion of the cybersecurity assessment tool?
Well, the key areas that the tool focuses on, again, is our process control system. So it's very, very obvious that a key player needs to be subject matter experts within the SCADA side of the organization, folks who really know the networks, know the SCADA systems, know how the SCADA system is configured and maintained, and also things like contractor activity, where contractors are working or where they might be working. But the tool doesn't stop just at process control systems. In other words, cybersecurity requires that there be security throughout the whole organization, and so folks who are familiar with the business network and business systems also need to provide very important information. A lot of times, the IT department knows about and provides things like VPN capability for remote access, and so they're the kind of two key areas of subject matter expertise that's needed. Again, with a heavy knowledge of SCADA and say the business network.
Okay, well, to add to that, then, do you see this? I mean, like you said, you have as you're going through it, you're going to have to pull in the right subject matter experts. But as we've seen on a lot of the other presentations that we've hosted, to address security, oftentimes it requires a large group of individuals from different areas of the utility. Do you see this as a collaborative effort, or is it limited to just a couple of folks with either the IT background or the SCADA background going through it?
Well, yeah, of course it's collaborative. I mean, there's a fair amount of information that people need to collect and make sure is correct when they are selecting the various use cases. And so I'm just talking about the ability to select the use cases and run the tool. Obviously, the output of the tool, that needs to have, complete organization buy-in. So I would say broad organizational involvement in the tool is necessary from that standpoint. So both in terms of collecting the information, but then the eventual implementation of a cybersecurity improvements plan that gets developed as a result of this.
Okay.
So I don't.
Bob,
no
George,
one group
you
will
likewise
have
I'm sorry. I was. Go ahead. Say that again.
I would just say no one group will have all the answers.
Okay. Bob, George, I guess you also were involved somewhat in developing the cybersecurity tool, and I guess in your experience with it, do you have anything to add, or would you concur with statements Bob Daly made there?
In general, yes. It's definitely a collaborative effort. You want anybody's input. I would say, though, that the tool, one of the key differentiators and strengths of the tool is that you do not have to have a high degree of technical prowess in order to use it. So the whole premise of the tool's approach is that it's based on use cases in which you are asked to indicate how you use your system. So you're not being asked whether or not you're using any specific technologies or network architectures, but it's asking for questions. Are you using 802.11 wireless networks? Do you have shared network infrastructure? So it is designed so that even if you're with a smaller organization or you don't have a lot of depth within your organization, it is possible to use the tool and still get meaningful results, if only as forming the basis for doing further research, indicating where further research is needed. And I also like to think of it, you can use it in two different approaches. There's a top-down approach in which executives, managers, people at the executive level run through the tool, again, select use cases that describe their utility, and then the report provides a basis from which they can ask their technical staff if all of these areas are being addressed. So even without being technical experts themselves, they can ask some rather direct technical questions. The other side of the coin is the bottom-up approach, where somebody within an organization, perhaps down at the lower operational level, is concerned about cybersecurity, but is having difficulty conveying that to upper management or basically getting their attention. They could run through the tool, again, select the use cases that apply to their utility, and highlight the fact that, hey, here's the guidance from AWA, and it is saying that we have to pay attention to these issues. So we should be looking at these things. So outside of the normal assessment approach, they can also be used on a more casual approach or a less structured approach, basically for finding out where to get started addressing your cybersecurity requirements.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Thank you guys both for that. What level of effort would you anticipate to go through to get the first guidance report that'll help define what you need to do to address your cybersecurity needs? What are we talking about there to go through it the first time? I'll pose that question first to Bob Daly. In your experience, what have you seen?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of that will depend on how much information you have readily available about your systems. In other words, the major effort associated with using the tool is making sure you're selecting the right use cases. And so in order to select the right use cases, you have to have information about your network, and about how your systems are maintained and configured. And so depending on whether or not you pull together the right source of right set of subject matter experts, as well as the right information sources, may determine how long it takes to run the tool. So anyway, to really answer the question, if you follow the procedure that was recommended here today, and that is download the guidance manual, print out the list of use cases, work with the folks who are the subject matter experts, and then sit down and use the information that you've gathered and the use cases you've selected. Going through the actual tool takes like no time at all. It can be done in minutes. But the key thing is to have the right people together. And so if you have the right people together and you have the right information with you in one shot, you could probably go through the tool within a matter of hours. When you consider all the discussions that'll happen in a room about the use cases and whatnot, you're probably talking about that kind of level of effort. But again, it's going to matter. It's going to depend on how much information you have at your fingertips.
Okay. Bob, George, my understanding is that the tool was built off several different standards, NIST being one of the primary ones, which was also developed based off a lot of the ISA standards. So they're all tied together. But can you elaborate on how extensive the NIST standards fit into the implementation of the cybersecurity framework?
Sure. The cybersecurity framework, again, the bulk of this cybersecurity framework, if you download the documents and read through it, is focused on the core. And so the core gets into those 5 functional areas: the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Each of those is correlated with multiple standards, which do include the NIST standards. So as you get towards the back of the document, John had a couple of slides in his presentation showing where the specific requirements to achieve the different implementation tiers are linked to the different standards, which do include the NIST standards. So it is not the framework itself. You can use it without going deeply into the standards, but it certainly cross-references standards and leading practices.
Okay. I guess shift gears a little bit here on from the legislative side. In a lot of the previous webinars we've had and seminars that we've conducted through the Safety and Security Committee, the subject of how to apply the standards, the NIST standards, or the cybersecurity framework, or the guidance tool, it always comes up with regard from a legislative perspective. And a lot of the subject matter experts that we've talked to in the past have indicated that there is no current legislation that mandates that utilities follow this standard versus another one, or any requirements. Obviously that comes into play from an insurability perspective, from a bonding perspective, and from a legal perspective for different utilities, and they have to make their own call on the judgment of what they've done to protect themselves. Bob, George, in your presentation, you mentioned that that the framework continues to be voluntary. But I guess just of your opinion, because obviously it's hard to predict what's going to happen from a legislative perspective. Do you see anything in the future that would lead you to believe that maybe there may be something more stringent for utilities to follow, where they have to adhere to certain standards, or do you see it continuing to be a voluntary activity?
There are absolutely indications that things will become more stringent. So at present, at the federal level, the Presidential Order 13800 is focused on the publicly traded critical infrastructure companies. There are, however, other efforts underway to basically put more teeth into the cybersecurity framework and cybersecurity in general. Of interest, there are many layers to the presidential directive, but another was that the use of the NIST tool is now mandatory within federal agencies. So it's gone from being voluntary there to being mandatory for them. We could expect to see that being a continuing trend. Also of interest are several initiatives going on at the state level. So Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York have, in the last 12 to 18 months, put out legislation or starting to put out legislation that is starting to require the presentation of a formal cybersecurity program to the state level for review. And with the assumption that that's going to eventually lead to directions and mandates coming down, if nothing else, at the state level. I don't want to go too far off away from the water and wastewater side, but on the power side, they do have the NERC critical infrastructure protection standards, which are particularly stringent and very, very complex, that all power companies with the potential to impact the national grid are required to adhere to. So there's certainly a precedence for mandates coming down, and with a lot of the press that we're starting to see things going on in the world, we can expect some sort of mandate to be forthcoming at some point in the near future.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Bob. Bob Daly, one of the questions that came in is you know, with larger utilities that may have multiple control systems or multiple SCADA systems, for users that operate multiple systems, can the tool be run multiple times by the same user to address their multiple systems?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the tool really doesn't know. Once you leave the web page, the tool doesn't know that you are you. It's almost like it's anonymous, but it is not truly anonymous because you log in. But when you're running the tool and you leave and you come back, it's almost like you're starting all over again. So absolutely, you can use the tool differently every time you log in. It may actually allow you to get a little more granularity too if you are looking at certain segments of your system in terms of looking at the tool, and may give you a different view of risk for the different systems. But you do need to consider the overall network infrastructure when you are doing the final tool for your organization. So for
system, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say on that, Rick, is so for example, if there's a VPN connection that's coming in through the business side of the network, and you're not considering the business side of the network because you're just focused on one facility, you may select, a different use case in that particular scenario. So it is important, I believe, to have a big picture view, of your utility when you're doing the final assessment.
Okay, you bring up a good point about the business networks, and we've all struggled a little bit as SCADA systems have become. It's more prevalent to have a combined network for SCADA, for business networks, for voice over IP, for the different technologies that are available as networks have gotten faster and faster, and combine that with everything that we've been taught. We're looking at cybersecurity is that you have to have blended technologies. You have to look at not only the SCADA issues, but also take advantage of a lot of the IT tools that are out there nowadays that can help, since SCADA systems weren't typically built around security. But that's always a challenge to combine the two departments, because they have different philosophies and different viewpoints on how best to protect systems. So I guess I'm going to pose this question to both of you. I'll start off with you, Bob Daly. How do you handle that to try to get the best solutions and leverage the knowledge of the IT department with the knowledge of the SCADA folks and the operations folks? And how do you address that when, a lot of the utilities that I've worked with here in recent years, their IT department has taken over the control of the communication and support of all the communication of their SCADA systems, and sometimes that goes very smoothly, sometimes it doesn't, just from the different viewpoints and perspectives that they have. Is that something that you've seen as well? And if so, how do you try to help address that?
I think for a long time there's been a desire to have better convergence of IT and OT, and probably the key for this, regardless of who it is that's supporting, say, that network infrastructure, is to have some sort of service level agreements in place, so that, regardless of who it is, they know what is necessary in terms of response and reliability and uptime for that particular piece of infrastructure. The one thing I wanted to point out is that the guidance tool use cases are relatively flexible for things like that. It does ask questions about whether or not there are non-SCADA staff who are involved with maintenance, and so from that standpoint, the tool already anticipates some of those questions, and it's built into the use cases.
Okay, Bob, George, would you care to give your thoughts on that same issue?
Just to add the point, basically underscoring everything Bob just mentioned, and also the fact that we actually had a very similar question come up at one of the recent conferences. I believe it's the ACE conference, as to who should be in charge of SCADA industrial control system security. It's important to note the guidance, the cybersecurity framework, and the AWA tool don't say specifically who should be doing specific things within your systems. They focus on what needs to be done. And so I've certainly seen over the years organizations, some have a very strong IT group, some have a very strong SCADA operations group, and a very weak IT group. So none of the guidance, none of the standards out there get into these organizational roles so much as focusing on what needs to be done. And then what you're left with is having that, assigning that responsibility to someone within your organization, be it IT or be it your SCADA operations group, your OT group. So the important thing is that things get done, and to underscore Bob's point, once you've done that, then you can work on things like service level agreements and understandings between the different groups, so that if you do have non-SCADA personnel, they're aware of the particular sensitivities of SCADA systems.
Okay. All right, thanks for that. Bob Daly, I want to touch a little bit on the training that your firm is working with the Texas section of the AWA organization. And on that training, I guess one of the questions I have is, who would you recommend goes to that training? Is that training aimed more at utilities? Is it aimed at consultants that may be working with utilities to help them, a combination of the two, or operations staff, or can you provide some guidance on that?
It's really aimed at people who are going to be using the tool, and selecting the use cases. So, so when you mention operations, I'm not sure that operations, would be the ones that are really driving the effort. They might come in as a subject matter expert, but really what we're looking to do is make sure that someone in the organization that's going to be driving the effort of using the tool is properly trained in the use of the tool. And so in the enrichment section last week, we did see a consultant or two, as well as some, I would say the majority of the attendees were local utilities. And so again, depending on the organization, the people driving this effort may come from SCADA side, which we saw in the meeting, as well as the IT side. So we saw folks who were from the IT side of the business.
Okay. All right. Going back to the tool itself, as far as some of the information that's in there and where it helps protect things, how does it address, or does it address things beyond the typical IP communication, the older model serial radio-based systems? Bob, George, can you elaborate on that?
Sure. And there are certainly some use cases which do describe the use of serial radio, 900 megahertz, and getting into older licensed and unlicensed wireless technologies. So those are encompassed by those use cases. Of course, the tool is continuing to evolve. I'm sure Bob Daly can expand on. I'm sure it's undergoing continual evolution. But there have been use cases added. In fact, I do know in 2016 there were use cases added specifically to address serial radio communications.
And so one thing that's important for folks to realize is that cybersecurity is not just about the use of, say, IP protocol and Ethernet. You can certainly have a bad actor use a software-defined radio system to hack into a serial network and send some bad commands as well. And so things like encryption apply both to serial as well as IP communications.
Okay, we're getting close to 1 o'clock here, so I want to try to wrap things up a little bit by asking each of you, in your experience and your knowledge of the tool and the other standards that are out there, and I'm sure you've each worked with several clients. I'll start with Bob George, but Bob, can you kind of go over what, if you're working with a client where you were beginning this process of assessing the security on their system, maybe the first 3 items that you would start with to guide them down that path?
Sure. Looking at it from a more formal view, of course, would be the AWA Cybersecurity Guidance tool, appropriately enough. So it is a good place to start. It is the recognized authority and guidance for the sector. And as I mentioned before, it is meant to be used by non-technical personnel. So you don't need to have in-depth technical knowledge to be able to use it. And it will give a good indication of what sorts of things are required. And then I would just look for the common mistakes of excessive access. So just think about in your system in terms of access. Start to define your use cases. How do people use your system? So if you can define how your system is accessed or should be accessed, define your own use cases for your system, then you start to look for what might provide access beyond that. So if you have a scenario where you need remote access to a system for an operator or somebody coming in doing maintenance, then start to ask yourself the question, is there access available to somebody outside of that personnel? What is preventing that personnel from coming in? And then the last thing would be testing. So I'm fond of saying it's one of the easiest jobs, parts of my job is simply asking, anytime somebody describes what they have done to protect their system in terms of cybersecurity, I just ask the question, how do you know? So basically do some testing, do some basic testing, have somebody basically rattle the doorknobs, poke at the windows and see what's open and available.
Okay, thanks. Bob Daly, where would you start?
So, I would agree with what Bob said about starting with the tool. So if you have nothing in place and you're worried, the cybersecurity guidance tool is an excellent place to begin. It's relatively easy to use. And it'll spit out recommendations for you that are prioritized, and that's a beautiful starting point. And so you can take those prioritized recommendations and then start to do an assessment. So that might be the second thing you'd start to do. And then the third thing is, after you do the assessment, then develop an implementation plan. Begin to implement those things guided by the priorities that the tool provides to you. So I think that's a good approach to start with, and it should be able to be done by smaller utilities as well as larger ones. Okay.
Well, gentlemen, I do appreciate your time and your willingness to volunteer to help with this webinar. I know sometimes these things do take time to put together. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. This wraps up the webinar that we have for today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. We hope you got some knowledge out of it, some ideas out of it. That's the whole purpose of the series of webinars that we're putting on. We do have another one coming up on August 16th, it's going to be focused more on the safety side and in more specifically about respiratory protection, looking at the TCEQ requirements versus the OSHA requirements. We do hold these webinars on a bi-monthly basis every third Wednesday of the month. So you can anticipate another one in October. If you have some ideas or suggestions of what you'd like us to cover on future webinars, you can route those to Nyla Langford at nblangford@sig-auto.com. We're certainly open to any suggestions you have. The committee gets together and we put our heads together and try to come up with different ideas that we think will be of interest. But there's nothing like hearing from you to see if there's some specific areas you'd like us to try to cover. In fact, the respiratory protection one was one that was actually suggested by one of the utilities in the area that we cover. So again, thanks to the speakers, thanks to the presenters, thanks to all that took part in helping to put this together, and in particular to Julie and Melissa from WEAT for helping to coordinate these things. They do a great job of supporting the different committees as we put these together. So we look forward to seeing you on the August 16th webinar. And again, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit to John DeCrane, if you could email them through WEAT, or feel free to email them to me or Nyla at sig-auto.com, and we'll get those to John so that he can get those answered for you. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you, Rick.
Thanks. Bye-bye.